We ended our discussion last time with a discussion of a very important influential work called the Historia Rusov that appeared in the first decades of the chronological 19th century, eventually published in the 1840s. And what kind of text it was, setting up a dichotomy between ethnic Ukrainians and Russians in the north. Not a professional piece of history writing, but nonetheless it was to have an incredibly strong influence on the generation of the 1840s and 1850s. And here, that generation was effectively encapsulated, typified by three figures: Mykola, Kostomarov, Panteleimon, Kulish, and Taras Shevchenko. Because of a limited amount of time, we can't go into the specifics about any one of these individuals, except I do want to say a bit about the third member of this group, or this intellectual trio among Ukrainians in the Russian Empire. Why? Because he was to have the greatest impact and influence on the subsequent evolution of the Ukrainian national movement. Now, this Taras Shevchenko, in contrast to the other two, was the son of a serf living on an estate in the Kiev province. But even though he was a serf, exceptional in the context of his time and his station in life, if you will, this young Taras was taught to read and write. And it was early on that he revealed a talent for painting. Everyone in the Ukrainian world, or the study of Ukraine, remembers him as a great poet, the national bard. He actually was a painter first and foremost, and a pretty good painter at that. And because of his talent as a painter, the owner of the estate on which he was born brought him to, or his son brought him to St. Petersburg, the imperial capital. There he was sent to study at the Imperial Academy of Art, became the darling of St. Petersburg high society, always a serf, by the way, owned by somebody. But to correct that situation, in 1838, one of the most famous Russian painters at the time, a man named Vasylii Briullov, painted a special portrait, and the income from this portrait was used to buy Shevchenko's freedom from his owner. Shevchenko remained in the imperial capital, St. Petersburg, continued to paint, to study, and especially to study the history of his native land, Ukraine, and most importantly, to write poetry. Within 2 years of coming to St. Petersburg, that is in 1840, he published his first major work of poetry called the Kobzar, or the minstrel. The minstrel. Let me quote a literary scholar about this work. Literary scholar George Rylskyi, who wrote, "The appearance of the Kobzar was the single most important event in Ukrainian literature. This work heralded a new and bold beginning and attempts to express what was still thought by many to be impossible, that is, a wide range of feelings and ideas in the Ukrainian language of the highest artistic form. And what do we see here? Well, gone are the hesitations about using what was dubbed as Little Russian dialect for other than minor literary genres, as some of Shevchenko's predecessors did in fact use it. With this work, Shevchenko began a perceptual process whereby his contemporaries came to believe that this so-called Little Russian dialect could indeed be a full-fledged literary language. Shevchenko's Kobzar and his next major work, published a year later, the Haidamaks, referring to that group of insurgents in the late 18th century. The content of these works was also radical. Form was one thing, the language, and now the content. The subjects of both of these long historic, or what we could call epic poems, were the historical exploits of the Ukrainian people, considered a worthy independent nation until their brutal subjugation by Muscovite Russian and by Polish oppressors. And so now we have Shevchenko, who creates not only the medium, that is language, but the message as well. The medium and the message. And what was that message? National pride in the form of heart-rending and memorable literary passages. You know, literature plays an incredible role in national movements. That's what most people remember, some phrase here or there from a great national bard. We're going to be celebrating a national bard this week, in 2 days. And who's the national bard that's being celebrated on January 25th? You come from Upper Ontario, so you should have heard of some Scots guy named Robert Burns. So Shevchenko is the Robert Burns of Ukraine. And therefore, in complete contrast to his quote-unquote Little Russian contemporaries, who still believed in multiple loyalties, you could be a Little Russian and a Russian, Shevchenko thought solely in terms of mutually exclusive either Russian or Ukrainian identities. And because Shevchenko was not a product of the aristocracy, the tradition of the nobility, he had little sympathy with their view of Ukrainian history. Shevchenko's revolutionary message considered Ukrainians, ethnic Ukrainians, as a nationality made up of all social strata. The group as a whole, he considered politically and culturally deprived, while the vast majority were also socially oppressed. Most of them were still in these days proprietary serfs or state peasants. And so, whereas the 17th century great Cossack, Zaporozhian Cossack leader Bohdan Khmelnytskyi, he was a hero for the 19th century nobility and those who had entered into the noble class from among the Cossack elite. Why? Because this Khmelnytskyi had, in their eyes, begun a political process resulting in their own present-day wealth and high social status within the Russian Empire. because it was Khmelnytskyi who had pledged his loyalty in 1654 to the Tsar of Muscovy. For Shevchenko, it would have been better if this Cossack leader had never even been born. In the year 1845, Shevchenko moves to Kiev, and there he accepted a position as a researcher in a newly formed archaeographic commission. An archaeographic commission which was set up by the Russian imperial government to study the right bank. Remember, Kiev itself is on the right bank, and the right bank was that area that was annexed from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth finally in 1795, half a century before, and the Russian imperial government was interested in integrating it culturally as well as politically within the rest of the realm. And to do this, they were going to prove that this area had always been quote-unquote Russian. And so they set up this archaeographic commission, and Shevchenko was hired by it. And he would travel the countryside and actually paint all these monuments from the past. By that year, 1845, Kiev itself had become the center of a small group of Ukrainian enthusiasts, formed probably the following year, 1846, a secret society that was known as the Brotherhood of Saints Cyril and Methodius. The Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood, that's reference to 9th century Byzantine brothers and later saints who brought Christianity to the Slavs as well as their first literary language. So they play a very important role in the historical awareness of Slavic peoples in general. Now, while there is some doubt whether Shevchenko, who actually, as I just said, was traveling throughout the countryside as part of his job, and then another man named Panteleimon Kulish, the second of this trio, he had left Kiev for another part of Ukraine in November 1845. So it's not clear whether they ever belonged to this society, but together with this Mykola Kostomarov, who clearly was an active member, all of the three, regardless of their relationship to the society, were later implicated in its activity. And what was that activity? Was this a revolutionary society trying to overthrow Russian imperial rule? No. It was a discussion group of a few young guys, not terribly much older than you sitting in this room. And that activity consisted mainly of discussions, then a formulation of a program that had as its goal the propagation of Ukrainian culture and the Ukrainian national idea. And so it's in this sense, with this Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood, that the Ukrainian national movement entered what could be called that second stage that we saw on your list last time, that second stage, or the organizational stage of intelligentsia-inspired national movements. This brotherhood did draw up a document known as the Books of Genesis of the Ukrainian people. Книги бытия українського народу, Books of Genesis of the Ukrainian people, probably authored by Kostomarov. And what did these books do, this one volume? Well, it traced in a kind of messianic fashion the origin of the world and the place of Ukraine in it. The goals of the society were to be carried out with calling for the abolition of serfdom, so that's somewhat of a revolutionary program. Also, and more important, the establishment of schools to educate the masses. But this idealistic Cyril and Methodius brotherhood never really got off the ground. A fellow Ukrainian infiltrator reported the group to the Tsarist police, and 10 of its members, including Shevchenko and Kulish, were arrested in the spring of 1847. All of them were put on trial, and all were found guilty. Shevchenko, who may not even have been a member of the society, received the strongest sentence, 10 years in exile and forbidden to write and print, because he could write and he had a message. Dangerous. And the imperial authorities got that message or saw that. With this trial and the sentencing of the Brotherhood's members, this first, albeit hesitant, effort at a purely Ukrainian organization was completely aborted. And aside from that, this Brotherhood trial now revealed that the Russian imperial government, which I mentioned already before, until then not only tolerated, but actively supported the little Russian cultural activity that was going on, in particular in the right bank. From now on, it was to be more suspicious of the potential relationship between, on the one hand, provincial patriotism, good thing, and national separation. From the imperial standpoint, obviously, a bad thing. And yet, the publication of Shevchenko's writings did provide the Ukrainian movement with a new raison d'être, a reason for being. Shevchenko succeeded in providing the movement with an alternative to the provincial Little Russian mentality that dominated Ukrainian intellectual circles down to the 1840s. And even if organizations may be eliminated by an antagonistic regime, the linguistic and the literary potentials of the culture could, as Shevchenko had shown, be revived whenever the political environment proved opportune. Hence the enormous importance of Taras Shevchenko in the Ukrainian national movement in the Russian Empire, and as we're going to see subsequently, even outside the Russian Empire. Now, this demise of the Cyril and Methodian Brotherhood and the dispersal of its members, Kostomarov and Kulish didn't get long prison sentences, but they were banned from living on Ukrainian territory. This was, in one sense, a serious blow to the Ukrainian national movement that was only slowly getting off the ground. But it did not spell the movement's end. Already by the late 1850s, there was a cultural revival underway, both within Ukraine and beyond Ukraine. First, within Ukraine itself, there was an interesting phenomenon that was occurring on the right bank. Again, that crucial area only recently acquired, or half a century ago, by the Russian Empire. In an earlier lecture, we saw how the Polish gentry, the lower level of nobility, continued to dominate the socioeconomic and cultural life of what in Imperial Russian terms was known as the southwestern land. That is, those provinces of Kiev, Volhynia, and Podolia, the right bank. And also, we saw how that area continued to be a stronghold of Polish national idea. And from that area was support for the Polish revolt against Russian rule in 1830-1831. We then saw how the Russian reaction to that revolt was to abolish or to replace Polish schools in the area with Russian ones, and to use the Little Russian cultural revival as an instrument to counteract Polish nationalism. Also, between 1840 and 1845, more than 64,000 persons had their noble status revoked. I mean, this like goes on forever. You make them nobles, then you take the status away. You make them nobles again, then you take the status away. Go on. So 1845, 64,000 of these people. Why? Because they could not prove with a sufficient amount of acceptable documentation their right to belong to that social stratum. Well, what did that mean? It meant that a large group of Polish and Polonized Ukrainian gentrymen, former nobles, now not nobles, they became state peasants or townspeople, and thereby socially closer to the mass of the Ukrainian peasantry among whom they lived. A whole school of Polish language writers became known as the Ukrainian School of Polish Literature, quite accomplished writers. But besides these romantic poets and novelists of the Ukrainian School of Polish Literature, there also evolved a kind of populist movement among those Polish gentrymen who were disillusioned by the failure of the revolt of 1830-1831, and who considered that the future success of the Polish cause was dependent upon gaining the support of the local peasantry. This whole question amongst the Polish intelligentsia and political activists, Poland ceased to exist as a state, how we're going to resurrect this state, should we have revolts against the Russian rulers or the Prussian rulers, or for that matter the Austrian rulers, because historic Poland was divided between these three. And so in the Russian Empire they tried this and it failed. And so, well, who are Poles? Is it just the nobility, or is it all the people who speak Polish? That includes the peasants and the townsmen, etc. So now many of these gentry are closer to them. And that resulted in attempts to understand not only the Polish peasantry living in the right bank, but the Ukrainian, ethnic Ukrainian peasantry as well, and to understand its language and culture. Get closer to the people. Who are the people that we say we represent? And such a trend was carried among some one step further by the so-called chlopomani. Chlopomani, chlop, classic East Slavic word for a guy, a peasant actually. In effect, peasant lovers, chlopomani. These were sons of the Polish gentry who were studying in Kiev and who called for the emancipation of the peasantry and for the democratization of society. As ethnic Poles or as Polonized Ukrainians of the gentry class or social stratum, they felt guilty for the centuries of oppression levied upon the peasantry of Ukraine, in particular the Rus Ukrainian peasantry. Some of the members of this group went even further. Remember, we spoke about nationalism, identity, multiple identities, mutually exclusive identities. These things are formed, changed, and so forth. And some of these gentry students or students of gentry background, they rejected their Polish identity. And according to themselves, they explained this by returning to what they considered themselves, or more likely their forefathers, to have been originally Rus Ukrainians. And so just as in the left bank, on the eastern side of the Dnieper, so here we are in this right bank, the concept of multiple identities, that is being a Pole from Ukraine or a Polish Ukrainophile, that was now replaced by mutually exclusive associational framework. One had to be either a Pole or a Ukrainian. You couldn't be both. And so for a few sons of the Polish gentrymen became now nationally Ukrainian. They simply changed their national identity. And some of them made very important careers as scholars, a linguist, Mykhalchuk, ethnographer, Borys Poznarsky, an economist, Tadeusz Rylskyi. But the leader of all of them who returned to Ukrainianism was a man named Volodymyr Antonovych, who later became the first outstanding historian of Ukraine and a professor at the University of Kiev, a Pole who becomes Ukrainian. Now, while this chlopomane, or peasant lover movement, was adding new strength to the Ukrainian national movement on the right bank and in the city of Kiev, way up north in the imperial capital, where these Ukrainian activists were exiled, St. Petersburg, there provided another setting for the Ukrainian cultural revival. And before long, St. Petersburg became the home of the leading members of the Syro-Methodius Brotherhood. Kulish, who was already in the city, he was allowed to publish after 1855. You see, you punish people, but this is not 20th century totalitarianism. You know, they get, quote unquote, rehabilitated, allegedly. Kostomarov was the author of these books of the genesis of Ukrainian people. He arrives in 1859 in St. Petersburg, and he takes up he's appointed to this very prestigious position as head of the Department of Russian History at St. Petersburg University, and becomes one of the leading intellectual lights of Russian imperial historiography. And even that most dangerous of all, Taras Shevchenko, released from exile in the Caucasus Mountains down in the south, allowed to settle in the capital, where he was made a member of the Academy of Art and was again permitted to paint and publish, which he did until his early death in 1861. Now, besides their own creative writings, Kostomarov, Kulish, Shevchenko joined several other Ukrainians in the imperial capital, who, with the support of philanthropic Ukrainian landowners who were sympathetic to the movement, started a cultural circle in St. Petersburg known as the Hromada. Hromada. They published an important journal called Osnova, the Foundation. Aside from the Hromada in St. Petersburg, they also set up Hromadas in Kiev. Now, what was the purpose of this Hromada movement? Well, in Ukraine, it was to prepare the peasants for their national as well as economic liberation, first by teaching them about, or teaching them the Ukrainian language. Now, how would you have to teach Ukrainians the Ukrainian language? Well, first of all, they didn't know. They just spoke something. It usually, very often was a mixture of local Ukrainian and Russian words thrown in, or in the West, Polish words thrown in. This is just what we spoke. They had no idea that this was a language. So now you're teaching them that they have a real language and a culture. And to do this in so-called Sunday schools, and by publishing, not in church, by the way, outside of the church, also by publishing books and staging plays in the Ukrainian language. And these developments mark the height of what we would call the populist era, during which it became the vogue of this intelligentsia from the cities to put on Ukrainian dress, at least the embroidered shirt, which you can see why I'm wearing today, just to share with you the message of being that intelligentsia going out to the people, to learn about their ways, ostensibly to gain their trust and confidence. To be sure, such expectations were rarely achieved. Peasants are not naive. They know who's coming. And you know how you could make yourself look like a peasant, but then you know how immediately you find out you're not a peasant? Because if you shook the hand of a student from Kiev, wear the calluses. Clearly, this is not a person who works the land. So you can try to make yourself look like them and act like them, but you're not. But nonetheless, on the eve of the era of reforms, remember this is a key turning point in the history of Imperial Russia, the 1860s, before the reforms and after the reforms. And in this era, it seemed as if the Ukrainian intelligentsia was, through these Hromadas, well on its way to providing an organizational basis for the national movement. So once again, it looks like we're moving forward. But the seeming intolerance of the Russian imperial government turned out to be short-lived. The mood was already changing in Russian intellectual circles. In the 1860s, Russian writers in several ultra-patriotic journals began to argue that Ukrainian, or as they would always say, Little Russian, was only a dialect of Russian, and that, to borrow a phrase from the leading Russian poet of the day, that is Russia's Shakespeare or Russia's Shevchenko, that is Alexander Pushkin, who wrote, all the Slavic nations should merge into the Russian Sea. All the Slavic nations, and obviously Little Russians included. And it's in this sense that the ideology of Pan-Slavism, which actually recognized individual Slavic nationalities within a larger pantheon, if you will, now that idea was being transformed by Russian publicists into an ideology in which all Slavs might culturally, as well as politically, merge with the great Russians of the Russian Empire. And also, while this is going on, Polish publicists, they were claiming that Ukrainianism or Little Russianism was being used as a weapon. Actually, it was. as a weapon to depolonize the right bank. Ukrainian writers like Kostomarov and Kulish fill the pages of their journal in St. Petersburg with responses both to the Russian and to the Polish attacks against the Ukrainian movement. Okay, here we are. It's 19th century, intellectual debates amongst young writers and not so young writers. But now these intellectual debates soon entered the world of real politics. And by 1862, provincial governors in Ukraine were receiving more and more reports about the supposed desire of Ukrainian leaders, quote unquote, to separate Ukraine from Russia. So those were the criticisms, the accusations, and then in 1863, those Poles, they revolt once again against Russia. And even though this revolt, like the earlier one, was put down, the Tsarist government was determined to end all manifestations, real or assumed, of separatism. So we're concerned with the Poles, and then the Ukrainian movement, seen now little more than a Polish intrigue. And this results in an atmosphere of suspicion and mutual recrimination. Several Ukrainian populists, activists were arrested. The Hromada societies and the Sunday schools were closed. Their publication activity ceased. And if that were not enough, the Tsarist minister of the Interior, a man named Count Pyotr Valuev, Count Pyotr Valuev, he issued a decree in June 1863, and this, what became known as the Valuev Decree, banned the publication of religious and educational books in the so-called Ukrainian language, and most especially banned, as the decree said, books generally intended for elementary reading by the people. We don't want to infect them with the idea that they may be Ukrainian and that they have a language. This Valuev's justification for such a move was uncompromisingly straightforward, and I quote from the decree: "The majority of the Little Russians themselves thoroughly prove that infamous line, there has not been, is not, and never can be any Little Russian language. Their dialect used by the common people is the same Russian language, only corrupted by the influence upon it of Polish. There has not been, is not, and never can be any Little Russian language." And so, the Little Russian debate now was simply ended by administrative fiat. There is no Little Russian. There is no Ukrainian language. And those who thought so were only a minority, and most likely an anti-imperial separatist minority at that. Now, if the Valuev decree was not enough, in 1876, a supplemental decree, if you will, known as the Ems Ukaz. Ems is a place in Belgium where the Tsar was taking the waters, as one did at spas in the 19th century, and he was sent this decree, and he signed it, so it took on this name as the Ems Ukaz, or the Ems Decree. Now, all books, including belles lettres, newspapers, theaters, were banned. So effectively, no publications in this non-existent language. Schools all had to be in Russian, literary Russian. The church, which was in Russian-ruled Ukraine only Orthodox, it became, the Russian Orthodox Church became an instrument of Russian nationalism, certainly undermined Roman Catholic Church in the right bank and the Uniate Church, which we are going to discuss later. For all intents and purposes, it now seemed once again that the Ukrainian movement lay dormant for the rest of the chronological 19th century. It was not until the dawn of the new century, the chronological new century, that the otherwise dormant Ukrainian national movement was given, in a sense, a new lease on life. Once again, the change came about in the wake of Tsarist Russia's ignominious defeat in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, and that defeat prompted social upheaval and what became known as Tsarist Russia's first revolution in the 20th century, the Revolution of 1905. The ruling Tsar at the time, Nicholas II, was forced to, however reluctantly, to issue an imperial manifesto that authorized elections to the Russian Empire's first parliamentary body, which was known as the State Duma. As a result of the first Duma, which the elections took place in 1906, 98 members came from those Ukrainian provinces in the Russian Empire, and 40 of them were patriots who formed a Ukrainian parliamentary circle. This circle published its own Ukrainian language organ, so now we have, even though the ban is still effective, it's not being enforced, so now the parliamentarians have their Ukrainian language newspaper, other Ukrainian language newspapers start to appear. And in 1907, during the second Duma's 103 days of existence, before it was canceled, the parliamentary circle called for the now introduction of Ukrainian language in elementary schools, establishment of a university department of Ukrainian studies, and the implementation of administrative autonomy in order to guarantee Ukrainian cultural interests. And yet, as soon as the Tsar Nicholas II felt more secure, this brief experiment in Russia's parliamentarianism was ended. And so, the revival of organizational activity, the beginning of the Ukrainian political movement during the first decade of the 20th century, were brought to an untimely end by the reinstitution of imperial bureaucratic repression and the backlash of Russian public opinion. In effect, by the time of the outbreak of World War I in 1914, which is the end of our historic 19th century, the Ukrainian national movement in Russian-ruled Dnieper, Ukraine, at best, had gone through the first heritage gathering stage of intelligentsia-inspired nationalism. As we've seen, because of the particular political circumstances within the Russian Empire, any further developments were either not possible or unable to evolve during a sufficiently extensive period of time. It takes time for a movement to work itself out. Result? That the Ukrainian-minded intelligentsia that thought in terms of mutually exclusive identities was effectively cut off from working with and educating the masses in a Ukrainian national spirit. And at the same time, those masses were being subjected to a state-imposed national movement and were continually exposed to its Russian imperial ideology, whether that be in schools or in churches, and then a very effective force, the army, where everyone, all males, had to serve. And then if the ethnic Ukrainian peasant ever left the village, he or she entered Russian towns and cities, albeit on Ukrainian territory, where all official transactions, whether in the factory workplace, in a government office, or on the railroad, or other means of transportation, everything conducted in Russian. In such an environment, it is not at all surprising that in terms of national identity, the concept of a hierarchy of multiple loyalties continued to prevail in Dnieper, Ukraine, right down to the outbreak of World War I. Being a Ukrainian, in the sense of something distinct from Russian, had no prestige and could not bring any tangible social, economic, or cultural advantages in the long 19th century Russian Empire. And so, any ethnic Ukrainians who might be socially mobile could improve their status only by becoming completely Russified, or be, at the very least, a Russian from Little Russia. In such a constellation, the idea of a mutually exclusive Ukrainian identity prevailed only among the intellectual and political fringes, marginalized fringes of Russian-ruled Dnieper Ukrainian society. Consequently, before 1914, it was not in the Russian Empire, but rather in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and most especially in its province called Galicia, where Ukrainian national idea not only survived, but actually prospered. And it is to that world that we will turn when we return.